Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on another session of We Connect Academy Learning from Women Leaders Around the World series. My name is Andrea, and I'm very happy to join you today on another discussion that it's more than important. I am very happy to introduce Lisa McAdams. She is a certified women business enterprise who's joining us from Australia. She is going to talk about a very important topic today: domestic violence and how it is a workplace issue. Lisa is founder and director of Safe Space Workplace. It is a domestic and family violence consultancy and training company specializing in the implementation of domestic and family violence strategies and training into workplaces. As a domestic violence survivor herself, with corporate experience, she has the knowledge and understanding of what businesses need to handle situations like this. Lisa is passionate about educating companies so that employees impacted by domestic and family violence are offered the right type of support. I'll let Lisa introduce and share more about herself, but I would like to remind all the attendees that you are muted for now, and if you have any questions, please make sure to write them down at the chat or Q&A boxes right on your right hand of your screen, and I'll make sure to read them out loud at the end of the webinar. This is a one chance opportunity for you to learn as much as you can, so we encourage you to do as many questions as possible. Thank you so much, Lisa, for being with us here today.
Thank you, Andrea. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. As Andrea said, my name is Lisa McAdams and I own a Safe Space Workplace. And the reason my business come around is because I realised firsthand how important a job was by actually losing mine. And I had a boss that I shared with. She was very, very supportive of me. But having said that, we didn't know what we were doing, either of us. And if anything, it ended up making it worse for me. So I've been doing this for 4 years. So obviously this webinar and everything I do is a combination of not only my knowledge and skills and my lived experience, but also from speaking with and consulting with and training in some of the biggest companies globally based here in Australia. So today I want to, let you know more about domestic violence beyond what we see in the media. And my other goal is that, one, you understand why it's so important that workplaces, whatever the size, get involved in supporting their staff, but also what support can help. And I'm going to share 3 really simple things that a company of any size can do straight away at no cost. So I will tell you more about myself as we go through the training, because I do share my lived experience to make it, more engaging and help you understand what it's like from the inside. So what is domestic family violence? It's important, first of all, and I'm not going to go through all these, and certainly people would come on, and I've asked the question to people in my field, and the list could go on and on. But I just felt it was important to just show you that all the terms that you could come up with that don't know. And also on there's VAW, which is violence against women, which is used when we talk about this subject, but it's more for me, for violence against women that's outside of the home and family environments, but it's a term you may come up with. And as you can see, there's a lot of things and there's a lot of differing opinion on what to use. I myself deviate between domestic violence and domestic family violence. And the reason I like to use the domestic in is because in the elder community and the disabled community, there is, they live in care homes and the abuse is often in their domestic environment, but not necessarily by a family member. Anyway, I just wanted to show you an overview of those. So the what. what is domestic violence? Well, it's made up of physical abuse, which is the one, we see in films, we talk about a lot. And the other one we talk about a lot is sexual abuse. The bit that's not so known about sexual abuse is reproductive abuse, and that can go one of two ways. It can be somebody coerced into having a baby they don't want because it traps them in the relationship, or it can be coerced and forced into terminating a pregnancy they wouldn't otherwise terminate. Emotional and psychological abuse, that, as it said, is using, turning people against themselves in a lot of ways, emotionally and psychologically. And these behaviours are often very, very covert, and it makes you lose a grip of who you are and what you believe, and your ability to have the strength to see what's happening to you and act on that. And for me, it was one of the worst elements of abuse. And that includes things like intimidation, stalking, harassing, all the things that psychologically limit your ability to see what's happening to you. Verbal abuse, I think, not with people that have been through it and people in the field, but I think outwardly it's probably underrated how damaging verbal abuse is, because it's consistent and it's not necessarily even just shouting and name calling. It can be just picking at something, everything somebody does, the way they hold a knife, the way they hold a fork. And these voices, eventually you take over. You don't even need the abuser to be saying these things. You start, if you're called stupid often enough, you start saying to yourself, I'm so stupid. And for me, it was the longest journey to change that behavior in my own mind and in my own speak. Financial abuse, and this one is, really where workplaces come in, because if you've got financial stability, you're in a better position to have choices on how you leave and when you leave, or even if you stay, how do you protect yourself? And not having financial autonomy can and does leave many people trapped in abusive relationships. Spiritual cultural abuse. This is an important one to understand because we tend to see as we are. And I'm lucky in my culture and my faith. When I left my husband, there was no judgment at all. That's not a world I come from. I I could leave, and people thought it was a shame, and divorce was, it's not frowned upon. If you're not happy, move on. But that's not the case for a lot of cultures. And you need to meet the person telling you where they are. I mean, if your faith is that you never leave an abusive relationship, you can't put that on somebody else. But at the same time, if you're like me and you come from a culture where it's quite accepted, you can't presume that that's the same for everybody. And one of my regrets is early on in talking about my experience before I had this business, somebody disclosed to me, and I, looking back, bullied her into leaving, but now I understand her culture and the impacts for her, and how her own family would turn on her and she'd probably lose her child. It's a regret that I put that on her, because if I was in her position, I would have done exactly what she did and is doing. And the other one, and this is becoming a big problem for law enforcement and courts, and it's called technically facilitated abuse, and that's all the stalking and harassment online. And it goes, in lots of ways, where perpetrators will pretend to be you online so they can get contact with your friends and find out where you're going, or they pretend to be you so that they can alienate your friends from you. Or the other token is they'll pretend to make a fake profile of someone so that then they can infiltrate your social media world in that way. And companies need to be aware of this, because a lot of times they can be hacking into laptops that go home with company information on it. And this is, as quick as governments and law catch up, technology moves on and abusers are getting really clever. And if you think now, the size of a 10 pence, 10-cent coin, you can buy a bug that you put in a car that will track exactly where the car's going. And now they've even got, if the car's not moving, it turns off, so it has a 2-year life. So one bug could, be 2 years, and they've only got to get your car once. And the other thing is they put them in children's toys, and you think, what you can do with a mobile phone is horrendous. So it's always good to say to someone, have you had your phone checked? And there's, stories of smart TVs being programmed so they can watch and listen in. So I'm just glad I left my partner in 2006, and it's not often you say thank goodness I'm old, but I left just before smartphones, and just with emails and text blasts, it was intimidating enough. So getting their headspace free of them is very difficult these days because there are so many ways for them to be tracked. And domestic violence in all its forms, whether it's sexual, physical, any of them, and I would say a lot of workplace behaviours as well, it comes down to power and control. And if you had to just have, if this webinar was 10 seconds long and somebody said, what is domestic violence? I would say power and control. But what are the behaviours that make up power control? And they're these. And they're all used at the same time, interwoven to the point you don't know what's happening. And like grooming, for example, and in my book I talk about being pre-groomed. And the reason I coined that phrase is I never want anybody to hear my story, because I did go through child abuse and I did go through childhood domestic violence, and then ended up marrying into a domestic violence marriage. But the reason I say I was pre-groomed, because I don't want anybody to have the impression that if you had a nice, loving childhood, that you won't be abused because you're not used to it, because that's where the grooming comes in. So grooming is, the best way I can describe it is, before I had this business, I ran another business in which I was a coach. And my job as a coach was to get in people's headspace, and where they thought they couldn't, where they had limitations and beliefs that they couldn't do something, my job was to get in and groom them for success, to make them feel like they could be successful. Well, in a domestic violence relationship, grooming is exactly that, but going the opposite way. So things you are capable of, you become incapable of. You start to not believe in yourself. You start to believe your friends don't like you, that you're not funny, that no one wants you at the party, that you're not good at your job. And it just breaks you down, and it teaches you, part of one of the behaviours that teach you learned helplessness. You don't believe any of your friends like you, so obviously you need your abusive partner more, because you depend on them, because they're the only ones that really like you. And then you add in the other behaviours that I haven't got time to talk about, but like gaslighting. And gaslighting is literally making you believe that what you perceive isn't real. And it comes from a film from the 1940s, where he literally, it's called gaslighting because the gas kept going down in the lighting, and he made her believe it wasn't happening. And when that happens, it's very disconcerting, because you start to not trust your own mind. And it does happen in workplaces. For example, I had someone that disclosed to me that she was being bullied in the workplace but didn't understand. But the boss would say things like, "Oh, great job, excellent report." But then if she reported it or talked to him, he'd go, "Well, what? I said great work, excellent report." So then she's like, "Am I paranoid?" And then he said, "You're so sensitive, everything I say." And then they're internalizing that it's them, that I am sensitive. They didn't say it like that. So, and that happens in relationships all the time, to the point you don't understand what's happening to you because you've been gaslighted. And with the other, like I said, I haven't got time to go into all of them, but with all these behaviours happening all the time, in the end, you really can't trust your own thought process, which makes you more and more dependent on your abusive partner. Now, I'm putting this in, and there's a lot of experts in my field now that are rejecting this and saying, we shouldn't use it. It's not like this. And when I first started hearing that, I was quite resistant, because when I was leaving, I had this tiny diary that I would write in, and I started to see that there was patterns to his behavior. It wasn't that he was really, really lovely and then horrible. I could see that the niceness was part of the abuse to reel me back in. So I was like, well, we can't get rid of the cycle of violence. That would be ridiculous. But then I started to think about it more and more, and I thought, well, no, they're right. It's not a cycle. And it's not, if you're in the build up and you think, oh, I've got a while to stand up, it's not going to be that. So I've recreated it from, talking to other survivors, talking to people in my field, and from my own experience. And this is what I now use. And I've dropped the word honeymoon, because to me, people that aren't in this world and don't understand it think of the honeymoon as the abusive person is actually meaning to be nice, that it's a nice time. It's not. It's as much a part of the abuse as any other stage, because it's the entrapment, re-entrapment stage. And I put all these arrows because that's exactly what it's like. It can go from explosion straight back to standover, or any of those ways it can happen. But it's important to know this and these behaviors, because you can have somebody that you're talking to that goes from, telling you horror stories about their relationship, but they could come back in a very short time and be talking about having this perfect partner. And that's the entrapment phase and the pulling them back in, because people wouldn't stay if it was always awful. And the other thing to know about this is there's no timeline, which is again why I've now joined the ranks of the cycle of violence isn't helpful. There is no timeline. You can be in entrapment, re-entrapment for months, years, and then go through this, or you could have a really quick, from entrapment to explosion to standover. There's no set pattern, except that these patterns happen, but there's no order except knowing that it's going to happen. And I think, if people stop looking for the cycle, we're going to better be able to recognize what's happening for them, and if you're in the relationship, for you. So who does it happen to? Basically, almost anyone. So it happens to women, and undoubtedly the stats show that women are statistically more likely to be abused in the home than men. The LGBTI community, and it's important to remember with the LGBTI community, things that can happen to them are different from what would happen for, say, a straight woman. Like that. Some people aren't out, and that's their choice, but they get threatened with being outed at work if they're not out at work. You've got trans people that are, have their medication taken away from them. So although the patterns are the same, the way this abuse is dished out is different and the same. Elder abuse, I touched on that earlier. This is growing. And here in Australia, we're actually having a royal commission into aged care facilities, because it's such a big problem. And that's why I said a lot of elder abuse, it is by children, and financial abuse is a big issue with the elder community, because obviously as they get older, they trust people with their money, and it doesn't, it's not always received with care and love that they would hope. But also in care homes, you've got people abusing and neglecting them, stealing their money. And as the elder population grows, so does the problem. People with disabilities, women, I haven't got stats on men, but here in Australia, women with disabilities are 40% more likely to be abused than a woman without a disability, which is shocking. But when you think about the power and control element, it's also makes sense in an awful way, because it's much more, the less autonomy someone's got, the much easier it is to have power and control over them. And again, people with disabilities, they have things like, if they need walking frames, they're put out of reach, they're not cleaned, that there's different ways that they're abused. But again, it goes back to power and control. Um, and I put this in because it's important to distinguish between childhood domestic violence and child abuse. Now, childhood domestic violence is where the child witnesses domestic violence, which is in of itself abuse, but the child is not directly abused themselves. And lastly, men. Yes, men can be victims of domestic violence, no doubt. The whys. Why do people grow up to abuse? And the same token, you know, to be abused. Like, I was preconditioned, not everyone is, but gender inequality definitely plays a big part in this thing. You know, the sense of entitlement, not by all men, but by men that abuse, is part of it, and they are brought up to, know it's okay. And if anything, what we're seeing from our leaders at the moment, and it is saying that this sort of behaviour is okay. Generational abuse, we do what we know. And I will say, from my own experience coming from child abuse, and I was abused by both my mum and my dad, it takes a lot of commitment to change what you know and what you were born to be. So, you'll have families where the generational abuse has gone on for generation after generation. Socioeconomic demographic certainly plays a part in it, but it's important to note that different socioeconomic demographics will be abused in different ways, but no social income is immune to this. You've got people that are, wealthy outwardly, but they're in an abusive relationship and they have absolutely no access to money. Societal and cultural issues, I touched on that earlier, and sadly, in a lot of communities, it is seen that women are still a possession, which plays into this. Isolation. Isolating somebody you're abusing is, a tactic that works really well. But like I said earlier, it's not just geographical, which did happen to me. Every time I made friends, we would move. But it's also the breaking between friendships. And like, my ex would do things like redirect my phone calls if I'd invited someone out to the movies. So my phone and my text went to him, and then he'd say, "Oh, change my mind." So they wouldn't mention it again. It wasn't a big deal. And I'd think, well, they never respond. And then he would step in with, "Well, you've got me, I'll take you." And the more that happens, the more isolated you become. Mental health issues certainly play a part, but they are not all of it. Plenty of people with mental health issues are also very, very nice, non-abusive people. Lack of community support. Again, that plays into the isolation. The less support, the more likely you are to either abuse or be susceptible to someone that wants to abuse you, because we all need connection and support. And for abuse, I think it is a lack of positive role models. It certainly was in my life and in my brother's life. So I think this is again where workplaces can come in. If we've got positive role models, both female and male, in the workplace, then we're starting to make headway in showing a different way. And again, drugs and alcohol play a part, but they are not the cause. They may exacerbate, but they are not the cause. So moving on to, how can workplaces make a difference? Why is this a workplace issue? Well, the overview is the workplace offers three things. Now, social stability, and I've just talked about community support, and our workplaces are important to us. I mean, if you ask people, tell me about yourself, they'll talk about, in the top five will be what I do for a living. They'll talk about, if they've got kids, if they're married, where they're from, and they will say, and I. Um, so that social expert, part of this is important, and your workplace is your community. So to keep that stability, and I've often said I ended up losing my career through the domestic violence I went through, but it wasn't just the money that mattered. I lost a big sense of who I was. I loved my job and I was good at my job, and that was part of my identity, which is the next thing. It's the emotional stability that it gives you. That's part of who you are, what you do, and your team around there. And I've often said, I work in very big companies, but it's not the HR director that's going to recognize this is happening to somebody. It's the person in their team that sits near them. And finally, the obvious one, continued career and continued employment offers financial stability. Now, I've used the word stability here because it is stable. I don't say social, financial security, because people can be on a very high income, but because of the debts that have been put in their name, or money that's been taken from their accounts, you can have someone that's actually a high income earner that has very little or no money or access to money. So keeping in that job, by the time they've sorted out the financial mess the abuse has caused, financial stability is often the best case scenario for a lot of people for a long time. But if we've got stability, we can build security. So what can you do? And one of them is to recognize the red flags. And red flags can be anything from change of behavior, or, if there is physical abuse, obvious attempts to cover up a black eye. I mean, I had a friend that had a sporting accident, and a puck hit her in the eye. But she'd just come to work, and she was like, oh my gosh, I was playing hockey. But if somebody's trying to cover it, why? Why can't they tell the story? And I don't mean just, I put a bit of makeup on, but don't want to talk about it, don't pretend it's not there. If they become less sociable, if their social media, the way they share is changing. And there's many, many red flags, more than I've got time to go through. But, if you're worried about somebody, talk to them, ask them very respectfully. And I would say, if you're in a position of authority over them, make sure that you're stating that this isn't a conversation about their workplace performance. I mean, even if there is issues with their performance, it's important that the two conversations don't go together, because if somebody's worrying about their job, they're not hearing your concern. And this one's important. Victims are in your workplace, but so are perpetrators. And that's important to recognize, because when you're saying to someone, tell your manager, tell your leader, you need to have people that it's safe to disclose to. And often it might not, I'm not saying often actually, but it might not be the team leader or the manager. It's a case of, accepting that these people in our workplace, and if we can accept that perpetrators are in our workplace, these are the people creating problems. People that perpetrate at home don't leave home and become thoroughly nice people at work. And it's one of the challenging, parts of my work, and where we're going here is, how do we deal with perpetrators in the workplace? And a few years ago, it was just, if it's called out, especially, you've got couples that work in workplaces. And I actually had a case where the perpetrator was fired, and then the outcome obviously was that he couldn't pay the mortgage. So a year later, she's still facing homelessness because the mortgage isn't paid. So how we deal with them um, is tricky, but that doesn't mean to say there aren't strategies that can work. Obviously, I don't have time to go into them now. Um, but I think in the first instance, it's very important to recognise that they're there, and they are, toxic in the workplace as they are at home. And we need more perpetrator change programs, in my opinion, because I think changing those behaviours, and there's a lot of perpetrators I believe that would change. And the other thing why I'm here, if you have an employee assist program, it's very, very important that you check in with them, that they have the abilities and the skills to, one, deal with um, victims of domestic violence. And when I say victims, I have to put out there that I'm happy to be called a victim, and many people are, but some people find the term very offensive. So it's always, always ask, don't label someone. Um, but it is important to find out if the people you're sending someone to for support is equipped to help them, because I've had some very bad experiences with therapists that have absolutely no idea, um, and could have put me in quite a dangerous position. So that is an important check to have in place. Now, more about me. Now, I put this slide up because you can see, I'm lots of things. I'm a mum, I'm a sister, I'm Australian, I'm English, which I consider myself very blessed to be both. Um, I like to think I'm funny. Maybe I should put and deluded there, but I do like to, I'm an author of a book, but these are just parts of me. There's lots and lots of things that I haven't even put there. Some because they're private, and others because, I've made my point. But once people hear my story, and it is improving for me, the more I become known as a businesswoman around this. But for a long, long time, it didn't matter any of these things about me. All people saw once they heard my story was this. I was put in one of those two roles. Everything else underneath it became surplus to requirements. Now, the reason I share this is not for sympathy, but if you know someone, whether it's in your workplace, a friend, and they're disclosing to you, see more than the story they're telling you. See them as more than a sum of their problems and the issues they've come to you with. Although they need immediate help, their life might be in danger, and it is like a lot to take in. But it's important that you remember who else they are, because they've probably forgotten, and you're the one that can remind them that they're good at their job, that they're funny, that they're the one everyone likes in the team, whatever it is about them. If you forget that, then who's going to remind them? And it's important also to remember that when someone's telling you about abuse, and I was very guilty of this for a long time, the abuse is so normalized in the relationship that people will tell you things that are quite horrifying. And it's important for you to take care of yourself, um, because some of it can be quite shocking to hear. And I can see now that I told people that had no experience of abuse, and I tell them these horror stories, and you can see they're like, they don't know what to do with the information. So just be aware that could happen if someone discloses to you. Now, just for a few seconds, I want you to imagine something that, the thing you would least like your boss and your colleagues to know about you. Just something you think, oh my gosh, imagine if work knew that. It might be a secret from your past, something that's going on now, the fact that you've got a speeding ticket, that you can't afford your rent, whatever it is, just imagine it, bring it up. Now I want you to imagine that your work know. They found out this thing that you really, really wanted to keep secret. And now I want you to take it a step further. Imagine you're the one to tell them. you're going to go into work today and tell your boss, your HR, a colleague, this thing you really don't want anybody to know. And now I want you to imagine that you've then got to say to them, I cannot deal with this without you. It's a personal issue, but without workplace support, I cannot deal with this. Now, think what that would do to all that you've built up, the respect from colleagues, how you're perceived, and the fact that you get to isolate this issue from your workplace. And now you're bringing it into work and saying, help me. Now, the reason I do that exercise is because disclosing, especially at work, is incredibly hard because you don't know how it's really going to be perceived. And I remember, I haven't got time to go into the story, but after my boss found out, um, we used to report the figures into the NASDAQ, and they were wrong. They were out. And partly me and partly lots of people, but it happens. It's not always perfect. But I went into her office and I was screaming at her that it wasn't because of what was going on at home. And I was just almost hysterical because I felt that now she knows everything I did was being judged back to that. And even as I was saying it to her, in my head, I was going, Lisa, you're not helping yourself here. But it's very hard to give up how you're perceived at work and how your whole life is perceived at work. So just bear that in mind. If somebody does disclose to you, as much as it's hard, it really is an honor that someone would trust you that much. Now, people need to feel safe to disclose. So, that's about being respectful in the workplace. And the story, the world is changing, but, I was, and it's a made up story, but I always tell the story of this woman who's blonde, and she's decided she's going to go to HR. It's taken her weeks. She doesn't know if she's safe at home. She just knows she needs support. And as she gets there, by the photocopier, there's a few people telling a blonde joke. And then she's like, oh my God, I'm already seen as stupid. So it's about changing the culture, talking about abuse and abusive behaviours, and getting people to feel like it's a safe place for them. And if they feel safe, they will disclose more easily. They might never disclose. But that's why I've called this business Safe Space Workplace, because, work is often the only place they go where they're not monitored minute by minute, because they're supposed to be at work. They know they're at work. So a lot can happen at work without the abuser having any idea that the partner's seeking help. Now, often they're tracked to the point going to the police station. Any of those things outside of work aren't doable. So creating this safe space, I really do believe will change lives. And an important one to know, both for yourself, and I touched this on earlier, it's important if someone's disclosed to you and they're trusting you, it's important to take care of yourself. It's scary what you'll be told, and you need to look after yourself or you can't help them. But it's also important to remember your boundaries for them, because what my boss did is she got overly involved. She helped me find a unit to live in. She went and got a bed with me, and it was wonderful. But I ended up going back because it was the first time I'd tried to leave him. And it took me 6 attempts, and the average is between 7 and 13. So, I went back. Then I was embarrassed and felt like I'd let her down. She was embarrassed because she felt like she'd overstepped her boundaries. And then going to work became awful for me, and that's how I ended up, the short version, that's how I ended up losing my job. I got offered a promotion. She would be my direct boss, couldn't do it. So I ended up moving with my abusive partner's job. But the 6th time I left, I went to a neighbour who, fortunately for me and unfortunately for her and her daughter had literally left a domestic violence refuge the week before. So she knew her boundaries, she knew the red flags, she knew the support services available, she knew how to help me, but importantly, she knew what not to do. Um, and what she did, and this is where I said I'd share a few simple things you can do. What she did for me is she lent me her phone, so any calls I was made couldn't be tracked. She lent me her computer for the same reason, and she told me the referral pathway. So she knew, I mean, Australia, it's 1-800 RESPECT is the domestic violence helpline. And if you don't do anything else, go and look up what yours is, because chances are someone going through it hasn't thought it through to even think about where to look for a helpline. I didn't even know it existed, and I'd been in an abusive relationship for 11 years. So she lent me her phone, she lent me a computer, she told me the referral pathways, and she told me I was being abused. But that's where her support stopped. She let me use her phone again and again to make different calls, but she didn't get overly involved and say you can move in with my cousin and all of the things you want to do, because she had tried that with her daughter and put her daughter in danger. So by knowing your boundaries, you're actually helping someone. Um, and the thing I'd add to lending someone a phone or a computer now, especially a phone, is if you're lending someone a phone to say, use my phone to phone the police, the lawyer, whatever they want to do, make sure you say to them, don't have your phone within earshot, because with all the ways people can be bugged these days, chances are their own phone will record them on your phone. So it's an important thing to say to them, don't have your phone near me. But just the freedom to make a phone call without worrying how you clear it or will it be tracked makes a big difference. And companies can say, borrow my computer, borrow my phone. And even if you haven't got a poster, just having a little handwritten thing about what the helplines are means someone sees it and that information is there for them. So I've actually got a poster. So if anybody wants to email me, I can of course send it to you, and it's just a little one you can put up in the workplace. Um, at the moment it's for Australia, but if someone's overseas, obviously I can share the helplines from where you're from. That's something I'm more than happy to do. And then just put it up, in the bathroom, in the tea room, behind the door if you're a very small business. And that's something even the tiniest of businesses can do. And I do believe that by creating the right culture, we can save lives. And that's, having a culture where we do check in on each other and we look out for each other and we're respectful, um, and we ask, how are you? And asking someone how they are can bring up other issues. And I will finish with this story because this works even if it doesn't end up being domestic violence. I worked with a company who were worried about a woman who was coming in bruised, but because they'd created a culture of, we're dealing with this and we take this as part of our responsibility to our employees, they asked her how she was going. And for her husband actually had early onset dementia and had become violent. But it was still a win for this type of work because she wouldn't have disclosed and she still needed help and support. And once you know what an employee needs, you can help them. And I think as we talk more and more about this, it's going to become more important that you are aware and trained, because the more people that will disclose. So that's it from me. I'm happy to take questions. And I've actually got a book called Domestic Violence, Changing Culture, Saving Lives, and you can get it there. Otherwise, you can contact me on the email address, or that's my website address. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa, for such an amazing webinar. It was very, very interesting. And it's very interesting to understand what are all the things that we need to take into account if we need to pay attention to what our colleagues and employees are experiencing. I don't know if I have any questions whatsoever from the attendees. If you have any follow-up questions or comments, please, this is the moment in which you can write them down on the Q&A box. We encourage you to make as many questions as possible. If not, you can also follow up with Lisa over her email. That's her website, and also that's your email account, right? Lisa at lisamcadams.com, I assume.
Yes.
Um, Perfect. So if you have any questions, I also would like to remind all attendees that this webinar has been recorded. So it will be available on our YouTube channel and also through the GoToWebinar platform. So you may receive an email tomorrow with the recording to it. So you are able to access it. But we also upload all our recordings on our YouTube channel so that people can have access to the archives of the amazing webinars that we're able to do on the monthly basis. So I don't know if anybody wants to make any questions. It seems that people is rather quiet. But thank you so much, Lisa, for everything that you have shared with us today. Congratulations for such an amazing story that you've been able to build. You've been able to really you're an example of the type of people who are resilient and are able to take advantage of circumstances instead of letting those beat you and in your life. So I'm really amazed of all your endurance and all the things that you've done. So thank you so much for sharing that a piece of your story with us. And thank you so
Thank
much for all the attendees. I don't know if you have any additional comments that you would like to leave here. Lisa, do you have any additional comments?
No. No.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. And please stay connected to us through our We Connect Academy website for more webinars of this type. Thank you so much and have a great day and a great night. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. Goodbye.